Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I know we've got a couple people just coming in now with fresh coffee. Welcome to our eye-opener in December. Today's topic will be covering innovation, and PwC has recently completed a global innovation survey, so we're looking forward to sharing some of the findings with you on that, as well as some of the relevant aspects related to the insurance industry. Our agenda is quite straightforward. We'll talk through some of the findings on our survey, as well as some of the trends in insurance, and we'll talk then a little bit about approaches that insurers can take to build innovation capability within their organizations. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Alan Butendag, and I'm the National Insurance Consulting Leader and your host today. Joining me presenting today will be Karen Ford. Karen is a director in our financial services practice and has over 20 years of experience in both designing, delivering transformational change across global financial organizations. She specializes in the design and implementation of corporate and organizational strategy, communications, culture, transformation, and experiential learning. Karen has authored a number of thought leadership pieces on innovation and innovation within organizations. Joining Karen today is Alex Watson. Alex is a senior associate in PwC's insurance consulting practice, and he has over 5 years' experience delivering technology-enabled business transformation to clients both in Canada, the United States, and Australia. So why don't I jump into it just a little bit here? You know, when I review the results of our recent innovation survey, what we discovered is innovation is not key, but it's actually essential to organizations seeking to remain relevant and competitive in a global market. You know, surprisingly, and Karen will spend some time talking you through this, but you know, when we look at the innovation index, Canada is really a middle-of-the-pack player. We have great schools, world-class thinkers, but it doesn't seem to be translating into global-scale breakthroughs in innovation. And one of the challenges when we look at financial services institutions is that traditional methods of measuring return on investment don't take into account the complexity of organizations' systems. And when we say systems, we're not just talking their technology, we're talking their structure, their culture, their organization. So really the change that's required to start harnessing and bringing innovation into the culture is substantial. And the ROIs on that are somewhat difficult. I think the one thing we've identified is growth and change are two realities that no organization can afford to ignore. So with that, why don't I pass it over to Karen, and I'll let her begin.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. It may take a second for me just to get used to this quicker, so apologies if I skip ahead on a couple here. So before I dive into looking at some of the findings from the survey, let me just give you a bit of background behind the Global Innovation Survey. I don't know if anyone's seen any of the data on that. I know it was launched in the last couple of days. But just in summaries, we interviewed 1,700 executives globally on the topic of innovation, and that was across 25 countries. And what we looked at were two key things. One is how organizations see innovation in their organization. And then secondly, over a period of 5 years, how do they see innovation evolving over that period of time? And from that, we have this global report that's been produced. And between sort of Alex and myself, we've looked at the Canadian aspect of that, and specifically what that means for financial services organizations. And we had a really good cut of data that we could sort of review and share with you today. So with that, let me go on to talk about some of the 4 key areas that we found as part of the survey here. The themes really fell into these 4 areas. One is the challenges for innovation that financial services organizations and insurers are facing. Secondly, the support for innovation. So what are the frameworks that are in place to support FIs here? Priorities for innovation, which was very interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment, because Canada has quite a different view to global counterparts. And then finally, investment and where funding comes from for innovation as well was also an interesting finding. So let's just go to number one there and look at challenges. So what we found is that nearly a third of Canadian FIs find it very challenging to build an innovation culture. And not only is it looking at those sort of the behaviors around innovation in an organization, but it's finding the right talent and also how to be able to measure the ROI from that. And Alan touched a little bit on that as part of the introduction. And what we found is that in terms of building talent and the shortage of talent in this space is that organizations are looking to sort of really try and encourage people to lead change initiatives in their organizations just to be able to help try and build that behavior and learning to be able to innovate in both small and large initiatives. And then secondly, measuring return on investment and looking at it more from a long-term basis rather than short-term basis. So it's not just looking at short-term initiatives, it's actually over a long period of time and part of a portfolio of initiatives that need to be measured. The support was an interesting finding. So if you compare, we pulled out comparing it with the US here, that Canadian FIs lag US respondents by nearly 20% in having the support framework in place for innovation. Now, this for me was really interesting because I didn't appreciate it was going to be that much less than our US counterparts. And what we mean by that is, if you take, for example, social media, is that typically Canadian FIs don't have as much of a strong structure to support social media as it appears in some other organizations globally. But not only that, it also includes things like having roles, responsibilities defined for innovation. It's having governance frameworks in place to support innovation, that type of thing. Thirdly, priorities for innovation. Again, another interesting finding here is that 33% of Canadian FIs prioritize technology as the main form of innovation over the next 5 years. This is interesting when you compare it to global counterparts and also the US, where what they're doing is they tend to prioritize more around target operating models, products and services, and also the customer experience. So there could be a number of reasons why that's the case. One of them could be is that for Canadian FIs, innovation tends to be driven out of the technology function. That's a good thing, but what it also means is that the emphasis is more on that technology front. But what we're finding is that leading innovators in technology functions, they're almost the guide for the organization to help structure an innovation framework around that. So it sort of stems out of technology rather than some of the other business units that we typically see in other organizations. And then finally, investment. So this was an interesting finding, and you can read the data two ways. So half of Canadian FIs indicated they take advantage of government funding, and there's also tax incentives that fall into that. And this is more than the UK and US and global average. So this is good news because it could be that Canada has more support available for innovation here. The other way you could look at it is that Canadian FIs may be more dependent on that rather than putting more of their own money into that type of investment for innovation. So those were 4 key findings for Canadian FIs. Just want to take a step back one moment. There was one interesting statistic, which was a big global one. So this is across all industries as well and globally, is that the most innovative companies, they're expecting a growth rate of 62% over the next 5 years. And that is more than the global average of about 35%. So, we'll come back to that number again in a moment, but it's almost when you look at sort of, innovation is really important, and it's really seen to be a key driver of growth. And unless organizations are now putting in place some of these frameworks to be able to learn how to innovate, there is a real risk of being left behind. And Alan talked earlier about being this middle-of-the-pack innovator, and we're going to go through some actions to help sort of move that forward. Okay. So, some interesting themes, lots of questions, and we're not going to be able to address all of those today. Here are just a few that we have. I'll just pick 3 up here, and we're going to talk a bit about this in a moment. But these are the types of questions that organizations should be asking themselves, just to make sure that they're covering off innovation as part of the way that they're doing their work. So let's just take, for example, that second question there, how is innovation being defined in your organization, and what is the role that people play, and has that been defined and explained? And what we find across different organizations, and we've been in those, and very different levels of maturity sort of fit along that line. Secondly, are you taking a strategic or longer-term view of how you innovate in your organization? This is also really interesting because when you manage a portfolio over a longer length of time and looking at that return on investment, you're taking that longer-term view of it rather than individual shorter-term initiatives and just trying to get those in place. And then finally, on the priorities, there's a good question that people need to be asking themselves, which is around, are there opportunities to further innovate your customer service products and operating model? And this just plays about just not relying on the fact that it's technology that's driving innovation here. It's the customer experience and technology supports that. So it's just looking at the way that you actually prioritize innovation. So just go back to some innovation basics. Just a quick question for the room. Who's been involved in innovation before? Good. We have hands in the air. Great. So what I just want to show is just go back to a few innovation basics, and then what we're going to do is share some stories about how we're making this real in insurance and some of the aspects of the framework, or practical aspects of how you can address it. So what is innovation? It takes many forms. It involves both incremental small-term changes, which are more effectively like tweaks to products and services, through to breakthrough innovation that not only are transformative for an organization, but they could also be very disruptive for the industry at the same time. Innovation encapsulates all of that different, those different levels of innovation. And what's clear from our research is that it's really high on everyone's agenda. And I certainly know just from my experience over the last 18 months, and I know Alex probably sees this too, is in terms of the type of even work that we've been asked to get involved with, a lot of it is focused around the innovation agenda. And the other piece that ties in with this is people are wanting to learn how to innovate. How do you train people in innovation too? So we'll talk about that too. But it's not easy, right? So for those of you that have been involved in it, it's not something that you can just flick a switch and make this happen. And we all know that within financial services, it's harder to innovate typically than in some of the more, I'd say, the more younger startup types of organizations that it's very easy for them to put newer technologies in place. But typically, the challenges in FIs that we see fall into three key areas. One is around, it's this term bureaucracy, but it talks a bit to what Alan said before. It's about the complexity of the systems that sit within financial services. Does make it more challenging to implement new ideas. The need for stability as well. So, we live in a highly regulated environment, and that is often seen to be a barrier to innovate. Sometimes it's an excuse not to innovate. And what we're seeing is some organizations now are using that regulatory sort of drive to be able to actually innovate some of their processes and to get those improved at the same time. Because there's a lot of transparency that now has to happen with some of these processes too. And then the short-term thinking we touched on a bit earlier before, but it's also having the data available to be able to make some longer-term decisions about investments and initiatives that need to be put in place, whether it's new products, services, operating models, or engaging in new ventures. And then what we've seen as part of the research too is that the leading organizations actually have innovation set up as a continual process. And this is something we'll talk about again in a moment with the innovation frameworks that organizations are putting in place. So on that note, just a bit of context there and just a quick summary of the findings. Alex is just going to give some examples of how it's been made real in insurance.
Perfect. Thanks, Karen. So making it real in insurance, what does that really mean? I think, based on what we've seen from our results, for Canadian insurers from the Global Innovation Survey, we know one thing is that it really place a high priority on technology, which we feel is leaving a bit of a gap in terms of how do they address products, services, as well as the customer experience. That's taking it from a bit of a historic lens. And what we've seen currently, recently in the marketplace is based on our insurance banana skin surveys that new risk entrants around innovation as well as social media are really signaling to us that Canadian respondents are waking up to understand that, hey, we need to start putting the customer first and close that gap between, not only our competitors locally, globally, but leading innovators as well. So what does that all mean in the sense that we're placing technology at the forefront, but we're seeing a shift towards a more short-term focus on the customer. What do leading insurers really do when they think about how do I put the customer in front? How do I shift my business model from product-centric to customer-centric? It's really asking about three key questions: is how do I deliver that omni-channel experience? How do I address my customers' preferences, behaviors for online, mobile, as well as face-to-face interactions with our agents, brokers, or even insurance representatives? How do we provide them with that real-time access to information that they seek, whether it be policy-related information or whether it be claim-related information? And then thirdly, as insurance companies, as financial institutions, we have a wealth of data on our customers. How do we better use analytics in order to dissect that information and then drive better outcomes in terms of products, services, and experiences for our customer? So what does that all look like? What have we seen in the marketplace in terms of customer-centric type innovations? I think it really is boiled down to both locally and globally is three key areas. One, we're looking at mobile. The use of mobile devices in terms of offerings, as well as opportunities to streamline processes is becoming more and more. For example, in Singapore, we're seeing the use of tablet innovations to streamline the sales agent process and really provide an enhanced customer experience from a one-touch point, that has historically been multi-touch point. In terms of retail, we're seeing increased amount of partnerships between retailers and insurance organizations. This is evident in North America, where we've seen Walmart partner with MetLife in order to sell life insurance products, as well as Costco partner with Aetna to sell health insurance products in their retail storefronts. And then finally, we see a bit of a disruptor in terms of social business models becoming more and more prevalent, particularly in Germany with Friendsurance. We've seen the rise of peer-to-peer models that not only disrupt how insurers go to market, but also potential pricing around products and services as well. And I think one last one worth noting in terms of what's close to all our hearts from the P&C perspective in Canada is the rise of telematic solutions. Recently within the marketplace, we've seen a couple of partnerships being formed between technology providers as well as insurers that are signaling to us that the rise of usage-based insurance is really becoming more and more prevalent as the organizations develop strategies in the years to come. And all of that's well and good, but how do we build that innovation capability within the enterprise itself? And Karen's just going to talk a bit more about that.
Thank you. Yes, excuse me. So how do you make it real? So again, a quick question to everyone. Who's actually got an innovation framework in place in their organization? I think I saw a hand over there somewhere. Right. So what I'm going to share with you is just some examples of what we're seeing in terms of how organizations are building this sort of innovation capability. And before getting into the detail on this slide, I just want to sort of emphasize this is about building a discipline within an organization around innovation. It's not just one or two aspects, it's actually building in that behavior and discipline to keep this going and maintaining and sustaining that. And to be able to do that, we've picked four key areas here that we see that the more mature organizations are how they're developing that capability. One is they're putting in place this innovation framework, and I'll show you what one of those looks like. And also supporting that is the process for innovation itself. Secondly, it's around defining pivotal roles. And I just want to talk, I'm going to take that right back to sort of simplicity in terms of roles that we're seeing in innovation in organizations, because they are defined differently, but typically they fall into sort of three key categories. Learning how to innovate. This is something that I know we're seeing a lot of our time being requested for now around how do we educate people around innovation, the tools and techniques to be able to help people innovate. And then finally, and this is an area that I'm personally passionate about is, the words there are collaborate for buy-in. I would actually take that a bit further. This is more about how do you build momentum within an organization. This is how do you sustain it. And one of the key areas of doing that is around how teams collaborate. And that is, when you look at leading edge organizations that are highly innovative, the level of collaboration in those organizations is very high. So I just want to talk a bit about that as well. So an innovation framework, what does it look like? Sounds a bit consulting jargon, but essentially what it is, it's around looking at how you can manage innovation almost as a business function. It's not set in one location or space. It could be virtual and depending on whether your organization is more centralized or global to do that. But typically it will contain three components. One is it directly links to the business strategy. The second piece is that you actually have an innovation strategy, and then sat beneath that are the operating model elements that support that strategy. So it looks a bit like an organization, right? Innovation's no different. It's how do you have that support to be able to make it happen. So I'm going to talk a bit about three areas in a moment: the process, the culture, and the team and resources side. But I just want to touch very quickly on the ecosystem, because again, a bit of a jargonistic term, but this is something that we're really seeing a lot of effort and involvement with, is around the way that vendors and suppliers have been literally as part of that collaboration network to be able to develop and create new ideas for servicing customers. And what we're also seeing is that innovation is now starting to be made a key competency of the procurement or sourcing function. And we see it, even when we do when we do proposals for work, and the way that procurement functions also encourage us to be able to come to the table with new ideas, not necessarily just about the topic we've been asked to go in about, but just some ideas to sort of kick around as part of that. So I just want to just raise that point there. I'm not going to talk specifically about the ecosystem today, but I just wanted to raise that as something that it's definitely an increasing trend that we're seeing. Secondly, defining a process. And again, I'm not sure that this is necessarily rocket science. I'm sure many of you have seen innovation processes before, but typically it contains these elements right from the start, where how do you create those ideas, right through to how do you then filter those, target them. And those ideas could be around whether it's products, services, it could be operating model, it could be new ventures, breakthrough, just incremental changes. How do you develop that idea? How do you market that idea, get it out there? And then what's the payoff at the end of the day for it? And this isn't necessarily just in monetary terms. It's actually in terms of how are you making your organizations more agile. And this is where, when we look at return on investment and how you actually measure that, what we're starting to see, for example, are scorecards that are starting to emerge as part of that payoff process, and how you actually track that over a long period of time. Just want to come back to the ideation piece at the front there. And, because it is all about creativity. How do you actually get those insights and challenges? And yes, you have, the traditional forms of research and so on that form part of that. But I'll talk a bit in a minute also around how the roles in innovation help create those ideas. But also, typically, the challenges, it's the problems that organizations face, are often the way that you actually generate those ideas for improvement. I think, Alex, you may have an example that you want to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we've seen, particularly with USAA, is they've been able to build out an innovation framework and directly relate that to what they've defined as their innovation process. So they've been able to put in support teams that help kind of incubate the ideas and then manage them throughout the innovation process. They've also been able to put in platforms that allow them to kind of manage that from a technology perspective, not only to capture the idea, but maintain the idea throughout the life cycle of the innovation process. And then really what we've seen is that all of these structures and processes in place has been able to allow them to empower 22,000 employees to then become their wave of next innovators.
Okay. So roles. So, oh gosh, we see the roles in innovation in lots of different ways. Some organizations have chief innovation officers. Sometimes it sits within a marketing function. Sometimes it sits within technology. And as you know from the research that we've had, we know that typically for FIs here in Canada, it tends to fall more in that technology function. But really there are, when we have a framework in place and you have that process, there are typically three groups of roles. And I just want to talk a bit about these, because often what happens is people think of innovation as just being, you have the lead technology, innovation officer, and then it's all driven from there, and that's not the case at all. So what we find is you have the role of the creator of the idea. And when we say that, it's not just out of the, whether it's the technology function, but typically what we find is those people that are at the front line that often have the best ideas, and how you actually capture that and bring that back, because they are the ones that are dealing with customers and clients every day. And they're also the ones that are also spotting those opportunities to build that closer relationship, a more intimate relationship with the customer. And everyone's an innovator. And sometimes this is the kind of message that's not shared with everybody within organizations. It seems to be just within certain functions and areas. And it's not everyone has that opportunity to be an innovator. Everybody has an idea. Everyone spies problems every day that they can actually improve on. And this is where the role of, we call it the guide, becomes incredibly important. So this is where there is somebody who will help sponsor that person or that idea through to be able to implement it. And that guide may not necessarily even be the most innovative person in their own right. I mean, it just happens to be somebody that's been able to support that person all the way through. And typically that person will often be well networked themselves. So what they will be able to then do is then pull in the network of people to be able to support getting that idea pushed through. And that network of people includes everybody from project managers across an organization. It could be finance. It could be marketing, the marketing area. It could be, for example, procurement. We talked about how do you pull in these different groups of people to be able to support getting that idea through to fruition, because often that idea creator is not the person that's going to be able to get that implemented. So what we're starting to see is the role of, I don't want to use the word committee, but it's almost like working groups or teams that are set up with representatives from different parts of the business that can help form part of that network that it's easy to tap into to then implement ideas. And I think we've got a few in insurance, right, that we've seen.
Yeah, I think a great example we've seen is when we worked with MetLife, one of their key challenges is that the way that they look at innovation is really a cultural issue. Like how do we change our culture in order to help support innovation, moving forward? And one of the key ways that they've been able to do that is exactly, have a creator, have a guide, and have a network. For the creator, what we've seen is them build out innovation communities of practice, where they actually target specific business areas and foster innovation, engaging frontline staff that's really supported by their innovation support teams who act as the guide, taking those ideas, modifying those ideas, and bringing those ideas to the point where we can actually, push them to the network, which they've called Met Ventures, in order to, help provide that business case, provide that structure, and then we leverage the executive group to allow them to really, understand the business case, fund it, and then have that idea come into fruition to that business area.
And I would say, within, even just within the last 12 months, I mean, I'm just looking at even not just insurance, but also the banks too, and the way that they're starting to define these roles now is becoming much more visible. And even the way that internal intranet sites are now being set up with actual innovation areas within those websites to be able to then create those ideas and see them through. So learning how to innovate. This area is really exciting me. I'd say in the last 6 months, I've personally received probably about, I've had about 4 requests for how do we learn about innovation. And what's interesting, this isn't about just putting people through a course on innovation. It's actually been really interesting. It's actually those real deep practical insights in how you apply innovation tools and techniques. And what we're seeing is, and it's not so much just generally around for all employees, but it's specifically around leadership programs that help people understand the concepts of innovation and how they can then push that down through the organization through this almost leaders developing leaders approach. And then what we're seeing is it falls into 3 areas that organizations are interested in. So one is it's in that, we call it in the lab learning. So it's almost like establishing an internal lab yourselves to be able to then teach people around innovation tools, techniques, simple things like, how do you do, what are different ways to do brainstorming exercises, right from that type of basics through to what is innovation, what is the process for innovation, and what is the framework that the organization has to be able to implement it. So that's one side of it. The second piece is in the field. So what we're also seeing is requests for connections to other leading organizations, not just financial services, but those that are seen to be leading innovators, And then the idea is that go visit them for a day to understand not only what are their frameworks and how they've set up their innovation profiles within their business, but also how they've overcome some of the challenges that they've faced as part of that. So it's really taken a much broader view than just looking at within the insurance and financial services industry and global, so not just here in Canada, but it's taking the learning from elsewhere. And then finally, for those leaders as they go through this, it's the last piece here, which is around in the real world. So how do you apply that learning from in the lab and in the classroom? You know, what we've seen externally with other organizations, how do you then shape that and make that real within your organization? And we're seeing some quite interesting things that people are doing in this space, because what they're doing is they're actually putting in place those leaders that then come back are actually setting up initiatives within their specific functional areas to drive innovation through. And I know you've got another example for that, I think, too, right? So,
yeah, you know, one of the things that we hear from leaders is how do we kind of keep that collaboration and sustainment of innovation throughout the organization? And what we've seen across a number of U.S. insurers is that they underpin that by a technology or an idea management platform that allows them not only to kind of foster those ideas and kind of incubate them, but take them through the process. And also, you know, we know that ideas initially may not be relevant to the marketplace today. However, you know, underpinning that with an idea management platform that allows them to sustain that idea will help them further when they're 10 years down the road and look back and say, you know, now that our world's changed, this idea can be implemented and we can keep that and move forward.
Yeah, and the other thing that we're seeing too is that in the real world, it's almost like when you've been through, you know, in the lab, in the field piece, it's actually taking a specific business challenge that the organization has and then putting people around that to be able to solve that problem with what's been learned in those first two areas. It's actually been really powerful when we've seen it in action. So it's not just a theoretical exercise, it's actually practically happening. And you'll see actually the picture there on the left is actually taken, and I'll talk about this, and actually it ties into the next one about collaboration, is, you know, these aren't just around, you know, just sit in the classroom type training. These are fully immersive experiences that people actually go through to be able to do this. So collaboration, you know, how do you maintain momentum and keep this going and sustain this innovation discipline within the organization? And what we're seeing is, and you know, we've been involved in a couple of these. I'll give you an example in a second of something that we did with Manulife, is that, you know, financial services organizations are now using some really highly immersive events to be able to solve problems. And they're doing it, and these problems have been solved really quickly. So typically by putting people in a very creative environment over a period of, you know, 3 to 5 days to be able to solve really big challenges that an organization's facing. And it's not just whether it's a specific problem, but it's also if they're trying to come up with a vision for something different as part of their business. And by designing a space that enables that to happen, where you pull global groups of people together, it's amazing what can be achieved in a short period of time. And what you'll see on the left-hand side there is an example. I know it's an artistic impression, but typically, it's just because I didn't have a picture that showed a room that had all of these areas all in one piece. But the way the rooms get laid up to actually move people through an actual experience to get feedback and commentary. And this feedback is then captured on boards. And then it's also fed back real time to the group. So it's not just something that's a workshop finish, you take it away, and then you come back with the outputs. This is all happening real time as you're going through the actual session. So an example of what we've done here is with Manulife, where they were putting in place, or they wanted to create a new center of excellence for their information risk management function globally. And as part of that, you know, they're a large organization, right? So, you know, what ended up happening is pulling together, we had about 40 people that were all brought together here in Canada. We laid up a room that was similar to what you have there, and they were able to design a whole new operating model within the space of 3 days. And typically we know that these types of, to be able to design even a new organization like this can take weeks, you know, and particularly with socialization of ideas across countries, it takes a long period of time. So just by making this part of a usual, normal way of working really accelerates not only collaboration with teams, but also in terms of getting to action really, really quickly. So that's a bit about collaboration that we see has been a key instrument moving forward. The other piece I want to say too on collaboration is really the importance of putting in place the leading edge technologies that allow for global collaboration to happen. And even with PwC, we have our own, it's called Spark. We have our collaboration tool that allows us to tap into our global network very, very quickly. And share knowledge. I mean, obviously we're a knowledge business anyway to be able to do that, but just by having those types of tools in place is a very powerful way to accelerate action. So on that note, I guess I just want to leave you with, before handing over to Alan, just sort of a message, which is, I really believe, I know just from what I'm seeing, it's really time to seize that innovation advantage. There is so much changing out there in the marketplace that I think it's really important for FIs, particularly here in Canada, not to be left behind, given what we've seen from the survey findings. And I just want to come back to the one sort of metric that I mentioned earlier on, which is, the most innovative organizations are predicting growth of 62% over the next 5 years. Do you want to be part of that? Because now's the time to put in place some of those frameworks to get that done. Okay.
Thanks, Karen and Alex. I think when I reflect on what we've talked about today and the findings of the survey, where I keep coming back to for insurers is it's about to be innovative, to take a chance, to be a leader in this marketplace. We need to observe a tolerance for risk, a willingness to fail, and some patience. When I think in some of the examples we talked about, many insurers have recognized that the barrier between them and being highly innovative is not one of a lack of people or lack of smarts. It's one of culture. How do they actually build into their organization the ability to acknowledge innovation and actually break down some of the barriers and the challenges? Insurance people have been built around managing risk. We're typically pretty risk adverse. We like to see reasons why things can't be done. When we start thinking about innovation, it's about broadening your mindset and saying, well, how might we be able to do that? And as Karen, I think, talked about, and what we've seen in a number of examples, is how organizations have taken this concept, started structuring frameworks within their organizations to build that, to nurture the innovation, and to then take advantage of the opportunities that come out of that. So I want to open the floor for any questions. At this point, we always like to leave a bit of time for some questions. Anybody? Mr. Simmons?
Culture. Culture is an incredibly difficult thing to change. And you spoke about creators, guides, and networks. To what extent are we seeing organizations seek to change the culture organically rather than bringing in teams from different types of organizations? So, a technology company, an insurance company bringing people from a technology company in to think about the business in a different way, so that there can be a more rapid change in the way people think and the way people embrace innovation. Mm-hmm. So I'm not asking this question terribly well, I realize that. So if I summarize it, to what extent are we seeing people trying to go for a fast transformation of the innovation process rather than just building processes and tools and letting the people that have been running the business for the past 15, 20, 25 years do it themselves?
Okay. Yeah, culture's a big topic. And I think what we're seeing is, there's something about putting in place that's just those, this is part of an evolving nature, whether it's the new term innovation or something else, right? Having those tools in place to be able to implement change is one thing. But I think what we're seeing that's different, and this is about, it's not about bringing lots of necessarily external people in, but the external piece is also about where you get the ideas from, actually. That's almost like the front end bit of it. It's where you get your ideas for it. But it's actually just making it more of a it's just this discipline, and it's this more open discipline that's there, rather than it being functionally kind of based the way that innovation's been done. What we're starting to see is just a lot more about putting in place just a more visible framework of how to get ideas implemented. So if you take, for example, and I apologize, this isn't actually an insurance example, but it was something that I've seen at BNY Mellon actually when I was doing some work in the US, is that, you know, what they have is they've actually set up, it's almost like they've kind of trumped the whole standard process for doing things, where what they've just said is, right, we want to have a clear line of sight from leadership through to staff around that whole innovation process through ideas. How do you support pushing that through? And what they have pushed at them literally every single day is on that website that they have, they are encouraged to actually not only put forward all of their ideas within that, but it's actually they're part of the teams to implement it. So it's just more, it becomes part of this way of working that they do individually, rather than it actually, to your point, it's like bringing in just lots of other people from, whether it's external organizations or not, but it's harnessing that whole collaboration piece now. It's just so important from what we see.
I think, you know, I've got an example of a Canadian client going through a transformation of their claims function, both reinventing the function itself as well as replacing some of the core technology. And you know, for any of us who have been through these kinds of transformations, we know that perhaps historically there was a big focus around what will our system do, what will be the new process in the future, what do the screens look like, and there was people in boxes and pods all around the organization that were building these things out, and then we had a training program, and we would go out to the front lines and we would train people on how to do this, and you know, then we would roll it out. What they did is they recognized that, you know, there was more flexibility around the operating model they wanted in the future, and there was more options around what the capabilities of the system could do, and they were trying to solve the problem for how do I create a better customer experience around my claims function, rather than I must do things more efficiently and effectively. That was part of it, but it was about the customer experience. So what they did is they incorporated a significant amount of input from the frontline staff in terms of what would it do, what should the process look like. And people have tried this before, and I think, you know, some of us may have been involved in those organizations where it ended up that the requirements became unmanageable, everybody wanted everything under the sun, and ultimately things didn't, you know, pan out the way they wanted. I think the difference here was they recognized they couldn't go that far down the path, but they put in place, you know, a framework, an innovation framework that allowed for those frontline staff in a managed way to contribute to the future. And then the teams that were building the solutions and building the future processes could absorb that and actually put that into practice. So it encouraged them to do that. At the same time, it developed a huge amount of buy-in, because the people at the front lines that were no longer receiving training, they were seeing what they envisioned brought to them. So I think that's a great example of how, you know, some companies we've seen are really starting to take advantage of this. Other questions?
Yes, I had a question just on the overall results of the global survey for Canada. I know you talk about Canadian financial institutions, but I think if you look at the sectors, you know, our banks are world class, particularly retail banking. Look at TD. Our three major life companies are world class. The P&C side in Canada, we have over 200 companies, 60% foreign controlled, more or less. And I would think I don't know if you broke it up by sector, but if you look at innovations among those sectors in this country, I think they're quite different. And I think on the P&C side, maybe because of the heavy foreign control, maybe a little, you know, fairly tight in how they're managed here. The other thing is, unfortunately, I don't know why, but the P&C sector in particular doesn't seem to attract the best and the brightest. You're not getting the top kids from the business schools. And I don't know whether it's the culture or the foreign control or what it is, but obviously you talk about leadership and people, and I think that will impact innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I agree completely. These are certainly some of the huge challenges we see, particularly on the P&C side. And you know, what's interesting, and it's something I commented on earlier, we often, find lots of reasons why we can't be innovative. The regulatory environment's tough. We're foreign owned. Our masters don't like that. We don't have the money. It's expensive. We've got legacy. So there's millions of reasons why we can't do these things. What I find interesting, and Alex mentioned a few examples, there are some carriers in Canada who are doing some pretty crazy things, pretty innovative things. Are they the biggest carriers out there? Not necessarily. Are they sometimes smaller and a little more agile? Yes. I would completely agree that the P&C industry has a long road to go. But what I find exciting is there's a lot of examples where we've got some carriers that are really starting to play in this space, whether it's mobile technologies, telematics, whether it's customer experience. There's pockets of this going on, and I think what's exciting is we'll see how many people start taking on. Sorry, Karen, I interrupted.
Yeah, the other thing I just wanted to comment on with this, sort of separate to this survey, is also when you look at the demographics with the different organizations too vary. So it's like everything else with it. You have numbers, and you can interpret numbers all in different ways with these surveys. But if you take, and this is just some insight that I've got from some of our Saratoga data, is that some organizations in financial services have a much younger actual demographic in their organization. So what's interesting about that, and just the way technology is now, is the way people learn, the way people communicate is different even between those organizations, and is a source of competitive advantage in its own right. So I'm just trying to give a more tactical example where there is one organization here in Canada that has a much younger generation than its counterparts in its peer group here in Canada. And what's fascinating with that is when you look at the learning programs, that type of thing that they're putting in place for those people, they're at a slightly different stage competitively, I would say, that when you compare it to some of these other organizations. So when I look at innovation and I look at the way people collaborate, all of that, and their ability to pick up so quickly that way to work, particularly in a global type of organization, it is a competitive differentiator, there's no question.
Another question? Yeah, Bill? You had a question, didn't you? I'm sorry. Okay, I'm sorry.
Fight for the mic.
I have a little litmus story, a very quick one. Then I wanted to mention a couple other things about innovation. I know a partner with PwC in Los Angeles, and her son works with Apple at their headquarters, and he's worked there 5 years, I think, and he can't tell her what he does for a living. So that's innovation, I think.
Yeah.
Well, that's the litmus test.
Yeah.
But I was going to mention a couple of things. One is how does compensation link into this effectively? I went to another seminar yesterday, and they talked about risk culture, and one of the things they talked about is the compensation model, and how does that drive the kind of risk culture the company wants. Same thing here, I think. And I also wanted to comment on the point you just made about the demographics of the people. I'm on the board of a relatively small company, and all the executives are kind of gray-haired or close to gray-haired. And the one thing that's in common is they all came from big organizations, MetLife in New York, ING in the U.S., Hartford. And they've been, the CEO who just came in 2010, and he's been with the industry 34 years. Finance, the CFO has been with the industry 27 years, the investment person 18, actuarial 28 years, and products and distribution 31 years. And this company is enormously innovative. And I think it might, and I've just been on the board about 6 months, but I think it may be because all these people were with huge organizations that were pretty bureaucratic probably to affect change. And they've all come in the last 3 years and affected change in an enormous way. And so I just think that's interesting to your point. I hadn't focused on that before you made your point about the demographics. I thought it was always interesting these people were gray-haired. And the board's pretty gray-haired. They have no limitations on age like a lot of boards, which is interesting too. So anyway, over to you on the compensation. The other was just, I thought, an interesting observation relative to the demographics of the management and the board.
Yeah. So just picking up on two, just on the latter point there on the demographics piece, is also related to that is diversity. So if you look at the way, I even look at the way, even we operate, right, as an organization is, the new ideas that come from just having a diverse workforce is tremendous. And what we're seeing, particularly in global organizations, is what they're doing is it's not just staying with what are the ideas in your country, it's actually properly researching and getting ideas from some of those other countries that aren't necessarily the leading ones, where they're perhaps a little bit more nimble with the way that they can think because they're operating smaller in some of those country areas, so they're quicker. So that diversity piece is really important. I think what you were just saying there talks a bit to that diversity of people coming in from lots of different areas, which is even more than just what the demographics are too. So I think that's a great point. On compensation, great question. So what we see is a lot of different, I call them incentive programs that we see sat around innovation. And I know you guys may have some comments in a minute around that, but what we see is definitely incentives around, if you remember the process for innovation, there were the 5 steps, particularly around that ideation is actually how do you incent people, and it varies depending on the business unit you're in too, around innovation. So it's not just tied to compensation, but it's other things too, where it's more social events, recognition, awards are big things that we're now seeing too. So I know, for example, I would say probably, certainly in the last 12 months, I would say probably 60% of the clients that I've worked for have an award program for innovation in their business. And that award program is not only compensation based, but it encompasses other things too. So whether it's, trips or, some form of recognition actually for that. And then the other side of it is that they then become part of the incentive for that is they're part of the implementation of that idea, or even potentially have some form of return based on the return of that idea being implemented.
Thanks, Karen. I think we've got time for one more question. I promised I would get back to you.
Brief. Clive Whitter from Export Development Canada. I was just interested in your comments on organisation and your experiences as to how formal or informal those organisational changes tend to be when you're trying to introduce innovation and change on an existing management structure.
Great question. So let me just recap. So you're saying it's informal or formal as it relates to specific innovation initiatives?
Thinking if you're trying to build a new culture,
yeah.
or you have a good culture
yeah.
with innovative people, but the organizational structure might not be right, how formal do you make that? Do you almost embed it into the existing structure and say, here's an innovation and change function reporting to the CEO, here's the importance? Or is it more informal structures about people's responsibilities and you're trying to encourage the cultural change in how people behave?
Yeah, I've seen it both ways at the moment, and I think that's because of the nature of the maturity of how people are growing their functions. It does vary. I would say where I've seen it most successful at the moment is actually it's set up as more an informal network that's set up, but there is a formal role for an innovation officer. And the reason why that is because the role of that person is to make sure they monitor the portfolio of initiatives that are considered innovation, and how they're tracking that over a longer period of time. So it's almost like they've got the scorecard for it. So that's formalized. But what's happened, if you look at those 3 roles, that network piece underneath is more of an informal, more working group kind of structure that gets pulled on as it's needed. It's not set up as its own separate area.
I think where they're coming from dictates the level of formality. So many insurers that have traditionally not been as innovative and not as sort of structured around this need that formal structure to kind of get it off the ground. People need to know where they go and what they should do and how it's going to be measured and monitored. Perhaps other organizations that are further along that path often will survive with a less formal structure, although, as Karen said, they're still going to have someone focused on that to manage it. So it is a bit of a mixed bag, but a lot of it is coming based on the culture that they're trying to get at. And it's the same thing we've seen with organizations that have struggled over the years to implement shared services and consolidate operations. There are some insurance companies in Canada that will suggest we're going to consolidate these functions, and they will go do it. Others, it will be a 2-year battle trying to figure out how it all fit together. So, that's what you're dealing with in the different. I'm very conscious of everybody's time, and I want to thank you for joining us. You'll notice on your chairs is a feedback form. We truly appreciate your feedback. It helps us design future sessions. As well, you should have received the copy of the innovation report as well as the FS cut. They were on your chair, or there will be copies available at the desk on the way out. Other notes I have, there's a stylus pen for innovative people using iPads that is available on your way out. Of course, it's branded with PwC, so you remember us. And I'll look forward to seeing you all in the spring of 2014 when we'll be hosting our next EyeOpener. We'll be around for questions if anybody wants to follow up, but thank you very much.